"Excuse me, young lady," Janine Wallace, the flight attendant, said with a velvet-coated firmness, the kind that sounded polite but struck like a slap. "First class is for paying passengers only." Imani Carter didn't flinch. She blinked once, calmly as if absorbing the moment, and then held out her ticket. "I am a first-class passenger," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "Here's my boarding pass." There was no arrogance in her tone, only the quiet conviction of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. But Janine didn't even glance at the ticket. She crossed her arms and gave Imani a skeptical look that lingered too long, her silence louder than any words. "I don't think so," she said at last, her smile now tight and paper-thin. "You'll need to step aside while I handle it." Little did Janine know, the young woman she'd just humiliated wasn't just another passenger. She was the daughter of the airline's owner. And the humiliation she tried to inflict, it was about to take her whole career down. Earlier that morning, the airport buzzed like a beehive, rolling luggage, blinking departure boards, and the occasional burst of laughter from families heading off on new adventures. The first-class lounge, tucked away from the crowd, was a sanctuary of leather chairs, soft jazz, and steaming lattes. And seated quietly in one corner, Imani Carter stood out not because she tried to, but because of the effortless confidence in the way she carried herself. She was tall, poised, and graceful, dressed in a sleek navy pantsuit that whispered quiet excellence. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to go home. Imani clutched her first-class boarding pass like it was more than paper, like it was proof of how far she'd come. Today wasn't just a flight, it was a celebration. She had just completed her studies abroad on a full scholarship, top of her class, and now she was heading back home to the States. It had been 2 long years since she last saw her father, Malcolm Carter, the man who had built one of the nation's largest black-owned airlines from nothing but a vision and relentless work. He never flaunted his success, and he raised Imani the same way. Most people didn't even know she was his daughter, and she liked it that way. In the lounge, travelers glanced at Imani from time to time, some with curiosity, others with something colder. But she didn't notice, or rather, she chose not to react. Her phone buzzed. A message from her father, about to board. "Let me know when you're seated." She smiled faintly and replied, "Almost there." All good so far. She tucked the phone away and took a slow sip of her coffee, soaking in the moment. But across the lounge, by the service desk, Janine Wallace had already clocked her. With her sharp bun, pressed uniform, and eyes that never missed a detail, Janine was the kind of flight attendant who judged before she spoke. And when she saw Imani, she muttered to her colleague, just loud enough to be heard, "First class is getting way too accessible." Her co-worker gave a nervous chuckle but said nothing. Soon the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Imani stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked with purpose toward the gate. She was early, joining the first-class line with ease. Janine now stood at the jet bridge, smiling warmly to a white businessman with a briefcase, chirping, "Welcome aboard," to an older woman in pearls. But when Imani stepped forward, that smile faltered. Only a flicker, but Imani saw it. Janine scanned her boarding pass. It read first class, clearly. But instead of directing her to her seat, Janine leaned in, her voice just above a whisper, but laced with authority. "Oh, economy is just down that way," she said, nodding toward the rear. Imani blinked. "I believe this says first class," she replied, holding out the pass again. "It's not a mistake." Passengers behind her shifted, growing impatient. Janine didn't budge. "Please step aside, we'll get this sorted out." Imani's hand tightened around the strap of her carry-on, but her voice stayed calm. "There is nothing to sort out. This is my seat." Janine's smile was gone now. Her tone sharpened. "Look, I don't want to escalate this, but if you don't comply, I'll have to involve security." And that was the moment. That sharp, burning moment. The look from strangers, the silent judgment, the sudden heat in her cheeks. But Imani didn't retreat. She didn't argue. She stepped aside just enough to let others pass, and then quietly boarded the plane. Inside the cabin, the lights were dim, the seats wide and welcoming, but every step Imani took toward 1A felt heavier. She reached her assigned seat, placed her bag overhead, and sat down, calmly, gracefully, her face neutral but her pulse pounding. Janine entered a minute later, her heels clicking against the aisle like a countdown. She stopped in front of Imani, arms crossed. "Excuse me," she said, the same words, same tone but now louder. Louder for the audience forming in nearby seats. "This section is for paying passengers." Imani looked up. "And I've paid." Janine narrowed her eyes. "I'll be verifying this with the gate. Don't move." And as the murmurs began and the stares sharpened, Imani Carter sat quietly, refusing to shrink. Because no matter what Janine Wallace believed, she knew exactly who she was. She was her father's daughter. She was the future of that airline. And this seat? It was hers. The boarding pass didn't lie, but apparently the truth wasn't enough for Janine Wallace. Imani sat upright in seat 1A, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her boarding pass still held between her fingers, like a shield she shouldn't have to raise. Around her, the hum of boarding continued, heels tapping, bags being stowed, the occasional click of an overhead bin slamming shut, but it all felt distant. What she could hear, loud and clear, were the murmurs. Passengers whispering behind half-covered mouths, eyes darting between her and the attendant who stood guard at the front like a gatekeeper of belonging. Some looked at Imani with pity, others with suspicion. But no one stepped in. No one asked what was happening or why a young black woman in a first-class seat was being questioned like a trespasser. Janine paced, speaking in hushed tones to another crew member before turning back toward Imani with a clipboard in hand and her chin raised, like a verdict had already been written. "Are you sure you didn't accidentally pick up someone else's pass?" she asked, her tone now softened with false concern. Imani didn't blink. "It's mine," she said quietly. "I was assigned this seat." Janine's smile flickered again, like it cost her effort to keep it in place. "And your father? He purchased this ticket?" There it was. That pause, that slight tilt of her head when she said, "Your father." Like she was waiting for Imani to admit it wasn't real. To reveal the truth Janine wanted to believe. That someone like Imani couldn't have possibly earned her place here. Imani nodded. "Yes, he's waiting for me at the destination." Janine gave a slight scoff and turned away, muttering something under her breath as she walked off toward the galley. The whispers grew louder. A woman behind Imani leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She's very composed though," like Imani's calmness was a marvel to behold instead of a survival skill she'd been forced to master since childhood. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a sports coat muttered. The judgment wrapped around Imani like a net. She gripped the boarding pass tighter, not for proof, but to keep her fingers from trembling. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was humiliation. A public stripping down, not of clothes but of worth. She felt it in the burning behind her eyes, the tightening in her chest, and the ghost of tears she refused to let fall. She didn't cry when she was the only black girl in her honors program. She didn't cry when her roommates made jokes about her good hair like it was something she borrowed. And she wasn't going to cry now, not when she had every right to sit in 1A. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't have to raise your voice to raise your standard. Hold your head up. You don't need to fight to prove you belong. You already do." But it was hard. The flight was nearly ready to depart when Janine returned. This time, she didn't come alone. 2 security officers followed close behind her. Imani's stomach dropped, but she didn't move. Her face stayed composed. One of the officers, a tall man with kind eyes, spoke first. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" His tone was professional but distant. Imani nodded, holding out her boarding pass again. "This is my assigned seat." The officers glanced between her and Janine. She stood behind them like a puppeteer trying not to pull the strings too obviously. "She says this is hers," Janine said, not to Imani but to the officers, "but the manifest says otherwise." It didn't. Imani knew it didn't. But Janine's voice carried that practiced confidence that so often overpowered facts. The kind of voice people believe because it's always been believed. The kind that gets people removed, punished, erased. "Ma'am, if you'll just come with us, we'll get this sorted out," the officer said, already gesturing toward the aisle. Imani stood, not in defeat but with dignity. She didn't argue, she didn't plead, she simply gathered her things, turned once to glance at the seat that had been hers, and walked down the aisle past passengers who wouldn't meet her gaze. In the back, economy felt smaller than it had earlier. The space more cramped, the air thinner. Imani slid into her new seat, placed her bag beneath the one in front of her, and stared straight ahead. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and stared at the unsent message she had started typing earlier. "Dad, something happened on the flight." She hovered over the keyboard, then added, "They moved me to economy. They didn't believe my seat was real." Her thumb paused. She knew what would happen once she pressed send. Her father didn't do half measures. He didn't raise his voice, but he changed outcomes. Imani read the message once more, then hit send. A few rows away, a small girl with tight curls leaned toward her. "That lady? She's always mean to people like us," she whispered. "She doesn't think we belong up there. I see her do it all the time." Imani turned, surprised by the sincerity in the girl's voice. She managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said. "It means a lot." The girl nodded, eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. "I hope she gets in trouble for how she treated you." Imani looked forward again, her face calm but her heart steady like a drumbeat rising. Trouble was already coming. It was cruising at 35,000 feet, and when it landed, it would have a last name that Janine Wallace would never forget. From her new seat in economy, Imani Carter sat motionless, the boarding pass still tucked in her blazer pocket like a silent witness to everything that had just happened. Around her, the cabin buzzed with polite conversation, rustling magazines, the clink of beverage cart. Normal flight noise. But in her ears, all she heard was the echo of her own breath and the quiet sting of disbelief. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't caused a scene. And still, she'd been cast out like an imposter in a world she already belonged to. A woman across the aisle leaned her head slightly toward her husband and whispered just loud enough for Imani to catch. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. She didn't look like first-class material anyway." Her husband shrugged. "Probably used someone else's pass." Imani blinked slowly. Not in shock, not even in anger, but in restraint. That kind of comment wasn't new. That kind of assumption wasn't rare. But it still landed like a weight each time it was dropped into a room she was in. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence, as always, did the heavy lifting. Somewhere up front, Janine Wallace was no doubt patting herself on the back, floating through first class like she'd just protected a sacred space from contamination. Imani could practically hear her voice, falsely cheerful, overly warm, offering champagne to those who had passed her invisible purity test. Her phone buzzed. It was a reply from her father. "Stay calm. I'm making the call now." No punctuation, just the kind of directness that meant a storm was already forming. Her father didn't believe in yelling. He believed in correction with consequence. Imani exhaled and tucked the phone back into her pocket. The seat felt smaller than it was. The air felt thinner, but still she sat upright, dignified. As the flight cruised over the clouds, a flight attendant, not Janine, passed by with the beverage cart. Imani pressed the call button. The soft chime dinged politely, barely cutting through the noise. She waited and waited. Several minutes passed. Other passengers got their drinks. Conversations carried on. But no one came to her row. Then she saw her, Janine, gliding effortlessly up and down first class, serving wine with a smile, laughing too loudly at something a businessman had said. Her movements were exaggerated, rehearsed, and Evakis realized intentional. Every drink poured in front of first class felt like a performance, an announcement, a message. 10 minutes passed. Imani pressed the button again. This time, the ding sounded louder in her head. Mocking, almost. Finally, Janine made her way back. Her steps weren't rushed, her expression unreadable. She stopped by Imani's row and leaned in, voice low and laced with icy professionalism. Yes. Imani looked up. I requested water earlier, she said, her tone calm but firm. Janine blinked. Did you? She replied, voice clipped. I must have missed it. I'll get to it. No apology, no urgency. She turned without another word and disappeared down the aisle again. 15 more minutes passed. No water. Around her, passengers were beginning to notice. A woman 2 rows up shot her a sympathetic glance. A man nearby shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The air had changed. Something about Janine's behavior was no longer deniable. It was visible. Deliberate. Then came the final crack. From the seat behind her, a girl, no older than 10, black, with thick glasses and a pink hoodie, polka tapping Imani gently on the arm. Her voice was soft but steady. That lady? She always treats people like you bad, she said. She doesn't think we're supposed to be up front. She does that every time. Imani turned, surprised not just by the girl's courage, but by her certainty. She wasn't guessing. She knew. The child's face was open, her eyes honest. I hope she gets in trouble for what she did to you, the girl added, louder this time. Imani felt her throat tighten, not with sorrow, but with a powerful, slow-rising sense of solidarity. She will, she said quietly. Today might be the last time she treats anyone like that. The girl smiled, nodded, and leaned back in her seat like her part in this story was done. Imani pulled her phone from her pocket and opened the message thread again. She typed quickly, Dad, she's ignoring my requests, she's performing for the people up front, it's getting worse. His response came faster than before. Stay where you are, I've made the call. 3 sentences. That was all it took for Imani to know that the wheel was turning. Somewhere above the clouds, in the cockpit of that very flight, a secure line was ringing. And when the captain answered, he would hear the voice of Malcolm Carter, not yelling, not demanding, but stating with clarity that there was a line, and it had been. Back in first class, Janine continued her victory lap. Siles, she poured, she joked. But even she began to notice the shift, the stolen glances, the stiff posture of her coworkers, the passengers who had stopped smiling back. Something had changed. The performance was wearing thin. And in the back of the plane, Imani Carter sat in silence, no longer waiting for justice, but knowing it had already been set in motion. And while Janine Wallace still floated through first class with a smile she thought was untouchable, she didn't realize that the wheels of accountability were already turning, because Malcolm Carter had made the call. Up in the cockpit, the captain was reviewing his checklist when the secure line buzzed, a rare occurrence mid-flight. He lifted the receiver, expecting a routine message. Instead, he heard the low, measured voice of a man who spoke few words, but each one landed with purpose. This is Malcolm Carter, the voice began. The name alone was enough to make the captain sit upright. I have just been informed that your lead flight attendant has removed my daughter from her assigned first-class seat. The captain, a seasoned pilot with over 20 years in the air, felt his breath catch. He'd never received a direct call from the airline's founder during a flight. The words were clear, steady, and calm, but there was no mistaking the authority beneath them. Her name is Imani Carter, Malcolm continued. I want her treated with the dignity she deserved from the moment she stepped on that plane, and I will be meeting the aircraft personally upon arrival. Make no mistake, Captain, I expect answers. There was a beat of silence. Then the captain responded, voice formal but tightened with urgency. Yes, sir. Understood. The call lasted less than a minute, but its weight shifted the balance of the entire flight. The captain lowered the receiver, turned in his seat, and exhaled slowly. His co-pilot glanced over, concerned. Everything okay?" The captain nodded, but his tone was clipped. "Tell the lead flight attendant to report to the cockpit." Now, back in first class, Janine was chatting with a passenger about a recent trip to Napa Valley. Her laugh a little too loud, her posture a little too proud. That's when she felt it, the light tap on her shoulder. She turned, startled, to see the first officer standing beside her. "Captain would like a word, immediately." Her smile froze. "Now?" Passengers glanced up as she followed the first officer down the aisle, her steps no longer gliding but measured and cautious. Her heart pounded as they reached the front of the plane. She entered the cockpit and found the captain waiting, his expression unreadable. "Miss Wallace," he said, his voice professional but firm, "I've just received a call from Mr. Malcolm Carter." Her heart stopped. "Mr. Carter?" she repeated, barely above a whisper. "Yes," the captain confirmed, eyes locked on hers. "The Malcolm Carter, founder and CEO of this airline, and father of the young woman you removed from her rightful seat." Janine's face paled, her breath caught in her throat. All the stories she'd heard about Malcolm's rise from nothing, his commitment to dignity and equality, his zero-tolerance stance on discrimination, they flooded into her like a cold wave. "I didn't realize," she stammered. "She didn't." The captain held up a hand. "That's not relevant," he said sharply. "What matters is how this situation was handled. Mr. Carter will be meeting the plane personally when we land. He expects a full explanation, and in the meantime, you are to treat Miss Carter with every courtesy this airline affords its first class." Janine's voice faltered. "Understood." He dismissed her with a nod. She turned and left, her mind racing. The power she thought she held had dissolved in a sentence, and the girl she'd tried to dismiss? She was the very one with the authority to dismantle her entire career. As Janine re-entered the cabin, her steps no longer held the sharp certainty from before. She moved more slowly, more carefully. Her eyes darted toward economy, where Imani still sat, calm and composed. Janine swallowed the lump in her throat and made her way back. Passengers watched her, curious. Some whispered, others just stared. Janine approached Imani's row and stopped, tray in hand, voice quieter than it had been all flight. "Miss Carter," she said, "would you like a drink, a snack, a hot towel perhaps?" Imani looked up, her face unreadable, her posture unmoved. Janine's smile wavered. "Are you sure? If there's anything I can get—" "I said I'm fine," Imani repeated, her voice polite but firm. Janine hesitated, then retreated back to the galley. Her show of dominance had collapsed into a desperate performance for forgiveness. But the applause she had expected from the audience was gone. Now the cabin was full of quiet judgment, and not toward Imani. For the rest of the flight, Janine hovered like a shadow. Every trip down the aisle was met with sidelong glances, every interaction scrutinized. She fumbled service orders, forgot drink requests, and lingered in the galley longer than necessary, gripping the counter like it was the only stable ground she had left. Imani, meanwhile, returned to her quiet. She didn't boast, she didn't gloat. She simply sat with the peace of someone who knew the truth would speak for itself. In first class, a businessman leaned toward his seatmate. "She's been acting strange," he said. "She's scared," the woman replied. "That's not customer service, that's damage control." And damage had already been done. Because when the plane landed, Malcolm Carter wouldn't be waiting with words. He'd be waiting with consequences. And just like that, the flight's tone had shifted, because now everyone could feel it. Janine Wallace wasn't in control anymore. She wasn't gliding through the cabin like royalty. She was pacing nervously, trailing invisible threads of regret, trying to sew back a dignity she had ripped with her own hands. Imani Carter remained seated, calm as ever, her composure unshaken. But it was a different kind of calm now. Not the silence of being silenced, but the strength of someone who knew her name carried weight. The boarding pass had always been enough. But now the woman who tore it in half with her doubt was racing against time to tape it back together. Janine made her way down the aisle again, this time without a tray. Just her hands clasped awkwardly in front of her and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stopped beside Imani's row, lowered her voice and crouched slightly, trying to appear gentle. "Miss Carter," she said, almost whispering, "can I get you something? A drink, snack, a meal from first class, perhaps?" Imani looked up slowly, her face unreadable. "No, thank you," she said, clearly politely. Janine hesitated. "Are you sure? We have wine, champagne, warm cookies?" Imani shook her head. It was subtle, but passengers were watching. A woman across the aisle raised an eyebrow. A man beside her pretended not to listen but leaned ever so slightly in their direction. Janine stood up stiffly, smiled again, forced tight. The murmurs had begun. For the next hour, Janine returned again and again, each time with a new offering. Warm towels, specialty snacks, a premium blanket, even a seat change proposal. And each time Imani replied the same, calm, polite, unwavering. "No thank you." There was no malice in her voice, no revenge, just poise. And it was that poise that made Janine crumble faster than any outburst ever could. Because everyone on that plane could now see the truth. This wasn't about service, it was about survival. Janine wasn't being kind, she was trying to erase the stain of her earlier arrogance with a mop of performance. But the damage was done. At one point, Janine leaned in again. "Miss Carter, I'd like to personally apologize. I misunderstood earlier. It wasn't my intention." Imani didn't flinch. "The matter is no longer in my hands." The words hung in the air like a courtroom sentence. Janine blinked. "Sorry?" "My father is handling it," Imani added, voice steady. "He'll decide what happens next." The sentence struck like cold water. Janine stood motionless for a beat too long, her smile slipping completely, her voice caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. She gave a small, shaky nod and turned away. In first class, a few passengers had begun to whisper more boldly now. "That's the girl," one man said. "That's the one they moved." "Wait, Carter, as in Malcolm Carter," a woman asked. "That's his daughter?" And just like that, the narrative flipped. What had started as suspicion turned into sympathy, then into admiration. Imani Carter wasn't just a young woman wrongly treated. She was the picture of grace under fire. The attendants, who had watched Janine with quiet unease, now exchanged knowing looks. One of them, a younger woman named Marissa, finally whispered, "I think she's in real trouble." By the time Janine retreated back to the galley, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She clutched the metal counter like it could anchor her to reality. But it couldn't. Not anymore. Because justice was walking up the aisle with heavy footsteps. Imani's phone buzzed again. "We've landed. Stay seated. I'm boarding the plane now." She read the text twice and allowed herself the smallest exhale. Not from relief, but from readiness. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, the pilot made an announcement that didn't follow the usual script. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a few extra minutes. We are currently awaiting clearance for a guest to board the aircraft." Passengers exchanged confused glances. A guest? But Imani knew. And so did Janine. She stood near the galley, her posture stiff, eyes fixed on the cabin door as if dreading the exact thing she knew was coming. Her voice, which had once filled the aisle like a siren of authority, was now gone. Back in economy, the little girl in the pink hoodie peeked up at Imani. "Is something happening?" she whispered. Imani smiled gently. "Something good," she said. Moments later, the cabin door opened. Sunlight from the tarmac streamed inside, and behind it, footsteps, confident, unhurried, heavy with purpose. Every head turned, conversations dropped, and into that silence stepped a man dressed in a dark tailor suit, flanked by two senior airline executives. Malcolm Carter had arrived. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. As he scanned the rows, his eyes locked on his daughter, and the flicker of a smile passed across his face, a smile only she could see. Then his eyes shifted forward, toward the front, toward the woman who had made the wrong call on the wrong day with the wrong passenger. And as he stepped forward, slowly, purposefully, every person on that plane understood. The real seat of power wasn't in first class. It had just walked through the cabin door. The cabin had fallen into a hush so thick you could hear hearts beating faster. Passengers clutched armrests, coffee cups paused mid-air, even the overhead fan seemed to slow. Because Malcolm Carter, founder of the airline, man of few words but mountain-like presence, was walking down that narrow aisle like it belonged to him. And truth be told, Imani sat still in her economy seat, head high, her phone resting quietly in her hand. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. The entire plane was now moving to her rhythm. Malcolm stopped when he reached her row. For a brief moment, every ounce of weight he carried as a CEO vanished, and all that remained was a father. He crouched slightly, his voice soft but serious. "Are you okay?" Imani looked into his eyes, and for the first time since takeoff, her face softened. "I'm okay," she said, though a flicker of weariness leaked through her tone. "It's just been a lot." Malcolm gave a small nod, one hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "You won't have to carry this one alone," he said. Then he stood, and just like that, the softness disappeared. In its place came steel. He turned to face the front of the cabin. "Miss Wallace," he called, voice firm and unmistakably authoritative. Janine Wallace, who had positioned herself near the curtain to first class like she could disappear behind it if needed, flinched at the sound of her name. Slowly, she stepped forward. Her voice cracked. "Yes, sir?" Malcolm's expression didn't change. "I understand there was an issue with my daughter's seating." Janine stammered. "Sir, I didn't realize." "The issue," he cut in, "isn't that you didn't know who she was." His voice stayed level, but each word rang like a bell in the tight air. "The issue is how you treated someone you assumed didn't belong. And that makes me wonder how many others you've treated the same way." Passengers gasped. A few nodded, murmuring their agreement. Some had their phones in their hands, discreetly recording because they knew they were witnessing something bigger than an awkward apology. This was public accountability, and it was overdue. Janine tried again. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding. I just thought maybe—" "Evil," Malcolm said, sharper now. You decided she didn't look the part. You decided she couldn't possibly belong in first class. You chose to humiliate her instead of asking a question. And you dragged my daughter through public humiliation just to preserve your own assumptions." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry. It's not me you owe the apology to." He turned to the passengers. "Let me be very clear. This airline was built on principles of dignity, equality, and respect. No one is above those values. Not executives, not pilots, and certainly not flight attendants with unchecked bias." The cabin burst into applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was a thunderous wave of approval, loud, firm, and righteous. Imani sat still, her hands in her lap, eyes steady on the woman who once dismissed her as a mistake. Malcolm turned to the two senior executives behind him. "Effective immediately," he said, not raising his voice, "Miss Wallace is to be relieved of her duties. Her behavior does not reflect the standards of this airline." Passengers gasped again, and Janine's face drained of color. "Wait, sir?" But Malcolm didn't flinch. "You are no longer authorized to speak on behalf of this airline. You may leave the aircraft under escort." The head of HR stepped forward, gently taking Janine by the arm. Her eyes flicked once toward Imani, then to the floor. There was no fight left in her, only a staggering shame. As Janine was escorted down the aisle she once ruled like a queen, heads turned to follow her exit. The little girl in the pink hoodie whispered to her mom. "That's what karma looks like," her mom smiled. "That's what justice looks like, baby." When the doors closed behind Janine, the tension didn't just lift, it shattered. Imani let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Malcolm turned back to his daughter. "You ready to go home?" Imani nodded, a quiet smile spreading across her face. "Now I am." He reached for her carry-on, but before she could rise, a flight attendant, Marissa, the one who had stayed silent until now, stepped forward. "Mr. Carper," she said nervously, "may I make a request?" Malcolm looked at her. "Yes?" She turned to Imani. "Miss Carter, would you allow me the honor of walking you back to your original seat in first class?" The cabin quieted again. All eyes were on Imani. She paused for just a second, then rose from her seat, head high, steps slow but strong. And as she walked the length of the aisle, this time to be removed but to be restored, passengers moved aside, watching her like a quiet procession of reverence. She didn't strut, she didn't wave, she didn't gloat. But every step said, "This is where I was always meant to be." When she sat in 1A again, Marissa offered her a drink with genuine warmth. "Welcome back, Miss Carter." Imani nodded. "Thank you." A few rows back, the same businessman who had doubted her earlier shook his head slowly and muttered to his neighbor, "Well, damn. I guess we were all wrong." The neighbor replied, "Some of us were just quieter about it." And up in the front of that plane, where power once denied her, it now bowed quietly. Because the seat they tried to take away had never stopped being hers. Imani Carter didn't recline in her first-class seat to relax. She did it to reclaim. The soft leather, the wide armrests, the ambient lighting, it all felt different now. Not because it was more luxurious than economy, but because this time, every glance in her direction wasn't questioning her presence, but quietly honoring it. Across the cabin, no one murmured anymore. No one rolled their eyes or leaned into judgment. Instead, they watched her with something close to reverence. They had seen her dignity withstand dismissal. They had watched her name transform from question mark to exclamation point. The same flight attendant who had once ignored her now moved through the aisles with quiet precision. Marissa, her hands no longer shaking, offered passengers warm towels and sincere smiles. There was a hush in the air, not awkward, but reflective. The kind of silence that comes after truth has walked through a room and rearranged everything. Imani sipped water slowly, her thoughts drifting. She wasn't thinking about revenge or reputation. She was thinking about what this flight had cost her, and what it had taught her. Not just about the way the world still worked, but about who she had become in the face of it. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. Her father had returned to the terminal after walking her back to her seat, trusting that his final word had done what it needed to do. And it had. Scrolling past dozens of messages, she paused on one that made her smile. It was from the little girl in the pink hoodie's mom. She had slipped Imani a note when she passed her row. Written in neat cursive on a napkin. "You're not just sitting in first class. You're showing my daughter she belongs there too." Imani folded the note gently and tucked it into her bag like a keepsake. That line would stay with her far longer than the flight. Weeks later, the ripple effect of that day spread through the airline like light through glass. Malcolm Carter didn't just accept Janine Wallace's resignation. He overhauled the airline's training systems. He didn't want damage control. He wanted cultural change. Mandatory anti-bias and inclusion workshops were implemented across departments. Real speakers, real stories, real consequences. New policies ensured that no passenger, no matter how they looked, dressed, or spoke, would be questioned for simply sitting in the seat they'd earned. But the most surprising change came quietly. Janine Wallace, after weeks of silence, sent in a letter. Not to beg for her job, but to face the wreckage of her choices. "I see now that I didn't just doubt her seat, I doubted her humanity. I carried assumptions I never challenged. I know I failed your family. I can't take it back. But I'm learning, and I'm sorry." Malcolm didn't offer her immediate forgiveness, but he did invite her to speak at the internal diversity sessions, not as an example of discipline, but as a living testimony to unlearning. Clips from Imani's story, shared by passengers who had recorded parts of it, went viral within days. The public responded with an outpouring of support, tagging it with hashtags like "Let Her Sit," "Dignity First," and "Dignity Had." Talk shows picked it up. Civil rights leaders commended it. Families across the country watched the footage together, many of them pausing to explain to their children, "This is what grace looks like." But for Imani, it wasn't about headlines. It was about healing. On a sunny morning, not long after the incident, she boarded another flight, this time beside her father. They sat side by side in first class. No tension, no tests, just quiet pride between them. As the flight crew moved through their checks, a flight attendant, this one new, this one kind, approached them both. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter, Miss Carter," she said with a genuine smile. Imani nodded, returning the warmth. She looked around. Everything was the same. But everything had changed. The sky outside looked wide and open, like it finally belonged to her too. And as she leaned back into her seat, eyes closed, a smile curved softly across her lips. Because no matter how they'd tried to rewrite the story, one truth had landed firmly in the hearts of everyone who saw it happen. This seat was always hers. Justice is more than a policy. It's a posture. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter where they sit or what they look like, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who still believes in fairness.